My name is Amelia Liam, and at 52 years old, I found myself sitting in the corner of a plasma donation center. Elijah, Colorado, gripping a clipboard. Like it was the last lifeline I had. The receptionist had just handed me a stack of forms, and while her smile looked polite enough, it did nothing to steady the heaviness in my chest. I was here for one reason. I needed $40 to buy my son's asthma medication. As I filled in my name and scratched down my sister's address, the reality of how far I had fallen pressed hard against my ribs. Only a year ago I ran a respected event planning company with clients across the state. I owned a home, a thriving business, and a life that felt stable, but life has a strange way of collapsing in on itself when you least expect it. Now I sat among strangers, pretending like this was normal, pretending like I belonged here. The pen shook slightly in my hand as I checked each box on the form. No recent tattoos, no travel, no drug use, no fainting spells, just a middle-aged woman trying to trade her own blood for a few dollars and a little dignity. What I did not know was that within that small vial of blood lay something that would change everything. A year earlier, my life looked nothing like this. Back then, I was the proud owner of Heartline Events, a company I had built from scratch over nearly 2 decades. We planned charity galas, corporate retreats, weddings, and community festivals. I had a small team I trusted, clients who greeted me with warm hugs, and a schedule so full I barely had time to breathe. It was the kind of busy that felt rewarding, the kind that made you believe you were building something solid and lasting. All of that changed in one night. It was a summer fundraiser for a local bank, an event we had prepared for with our usual precision, but somewhere between transport and storage, a refrigeration unit malfunctioned, and no one caught it in time. By the end of the evening, dozens of guests fell violently ill. Within days, the story spread across every news outlet in Elijah. Reporters camped outside my office. Lawsuits multiplied faster than we could respond. Clients canceled contracts. The suppliers involved shifted blame. And me, the face of the company, became the person everyone pointed to. My husband, Mark, could not handle the fallout. He said the business had consumed me for years, and now it was destroying us. One night, after an argument that left us both exhausted, he packed his things and walked out, choosing a fresh start with someone new rather than fighting through the chaos with me. His departure felt like a second blow, sharper than the first. Within months, the business collapsed under financial pressure. Our home was sold, every savings account drained. What remained was my son and me, trying to survive the wreckage of a life I thought was secure, and that was how I ended up in that donation center, holding a pen with shaking hands, trying to trade my own plasma for $40. The nurse who called my name looked barely 30, with kind eyes and a gentle voice that made me feel slightly less out of place. She led me into a small room with a blood pressure cuff, a scale, and a metal tray of neatly arranged supplies. I sat down, clutching my purse in my lap like a shield. First time donor, she asked. I nodded. She wrapped the cuff around my arm, made small talk, then tied a tourniquet and examined the inside of my elbow. Her eyebrows lifted. You have great veins. Easiest one I have seen all day. I tried to smile, but all I could think about was the medication my son needed. When she drew the initial sample, I barely felt it. She labeled the tube, thanked me for my patience, and stepped out to run the basic tests. Minutes passed. Then 10, then 15, when the door opened. Again, she was not smiling anymore. Behind her stood a man in a white coat. Older, with a serious expression that made the room feel suddenly smaller. "Mrs. Part," he said, offering a hand. "I am Dr. Samuel Pierce, the medical director here. We need to go over something unusual in your sample." Unusual, the word tightened something deep in my chest. Dr. Pierce sat down across from me. "Your blood type is what we call null. It is extremely rare, so rare that the international registry flags any new case immediately. There are only a few dozen known donors in the world." I blinked at him. I had come here for $40. I had not expected to hear a sentence that sounded like it belonged in a medical documentary. Before I could ask what it meant, someone else entered, a tall man in a suit carrying a leather folder. Dr. Pierce introduced him as Jonathan Blackwood, a representative from an International Medical Foundation. "Mrs. Liam," Jonathan said, taking a seat. "We need your help, and there is no time to lose." Jonathan Blackwood placed the leather folder on the table between us, his posture calm, but his eyes carrying a sense of urgency that made my pulse quicken. He explained that the international alert triggered by my blood type had reached a specialized cardiac clinic in Switzerland almost immediately. A patient there, a prominent figure in global finance, was preparing for an extremely complex heart procedure. The challenge was not the surgery itself, but the transfusions required during it. Only rational blood would be safe for him, and you are the only known match in the Western Hemisphere, Jonathan said quietly. I felt the room tilt. I had come here hopping to exchange a piece of myself for medication money, not to be told my blood might save a stranger on the other side of the world. Jonathan continued, outlining what sounded like a scene from a movie. They would arrange private transport to Geneva that very day. I would stay in a medical suite, receive constant monitoring, and undergo a series of small, spaced-out donations. The compensation offered was $3 million. $3 million. I could barely comprehend the number. I asked for time to make a call. Jonathan nodded and stepped outside with Dr. Pierce. My fingers shook as I dialed. "My son Caleb. Mom, are you okay? Did something happen?" he asked the moment he picked up. I told him everything, stumbling over details that still felt unreal to me. He was silent for a long moment before saying, "Mom, this sounds unbelievable, but maybe unbelievable is what we need." His voice steadied me in a way nothing else could. After the call, I asked to see the contract. Old habits from my business days clicked into place as I read every line. I requested changes, health protections, donation limits, emergency exit clauses. Jonathan agreed to all of them, and for the first time in months I signed something with hope instead of fear. The flight to Switzerland felt unreal from the moment I stepped onto the small jet. Waiting on the private side of the airport, I had never been on a plane like that before. Soft leather seats, warm lights, a flight attendant who spoke gently as if trying not to startle me. I kept my hands folded tightly in my lap, afraid that if I relaxed even a little, the strangeness of it all would wash over me too fast. Jonathan traveled with me, reviewing the plan once more as the plane crossed the Atlantic. I listened, nodding when needed, but my thoughts drifted often. I kept thinking of Caleb, of how his face lit up when I told him I might be able to pay off our debts, pay for his medication without worry. maybe even give him a future. Again, when we finally landed in Geneva, the sun had just dipped behind the mountains, leaving the sky streaked with soft pink and gold. A car waited for us, and as we drove along the edge of Lake Geneva, the world outside the window looked almost too beautiful to be real. The clinic itself felt more like a luxury retreat than a medical facility. My suite had tall windows overlooking the water, a sitting area, and a bed so soft it almost swallowed me when I sat on it. A nurse named Elise introduced herself and walked me through every detail of the upcoming procedures. Her calmness studied me. Later that evening, Dr. Emil Weber, the lead surgeon, visited my room. He explained the surgery plan for the patient and why my blood was essential to its success. His tone was respectful, almost reverent, in a way I had never heard from a doctor before. You are giving someone a chance they cannot get anywhere else, he said. For the first time since this began, I understood the weight of what I had agreed to, and despite the fear, something inside me felt quietly steady. The morning after I arrived, Elise knocked gently on my door and told me someone wished to speak with me before his surgery. I assumed it would be another doctor or administrator. Instead, she led me down a quiet hallway to a private room with floor-to ceiling windows overlooking the lake. Inside, seated near the glass with a blanket over his legs, was the man whose life now depended on my blood, Graham Whitlock. I recognized the name from business headlines over the years. He was the kind of man newspapers described with phrases like financial architect and the mind behind empires, but the person in the chair looked nothing like the commanding figure I had imagined. His face was pale, his breathing slow but deliberate, and when he looked up at me, his eyes held something I had not expected at all: humility. Mrs. Liam, he said, extending a hand that trembled slightly. Thank you for agreeing to meet me. I sat across from him, unsure what to say. He gave a faint smile. I wanted to see the person who is giving me a chance I do not deserve, he said. Most people who end up in my position had more warning than I did, more time to repair things I did not. There was a tired honesty in his voice that disarmed me. I found myself telling him more than I intended about my business, about the collapse, about how I had ended up at a plasma center with $40 standing between me and my son's medication. Graham listened intently, his expression softening with every word. You lost everything built on the outside, he said quietly, but you carried something extraordinary inside you all along. Most people never discover that. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The machines around him hummed softly, and sunlight shimmered on the lake behind him. I had walked into the room, imagining him as a powerful stranger. I walked out realizing he was something very different, a man standing at the edge between life and death, grateful for a kindness I did not yet fully understand. And for the first time, this did not feel like just a medical agreement. It felt like the start of something I could not yet name. Graham's surgery was scheduled for the following morning. I barely slept the night before. I kept packing from the window to the door, staring out at the dark lake as if it held some answer I needed. Elise eventually brought me tea and gently reminded me that worrying would not change the outcome. Still, my mind raced. The clinic staff moved with calm precision that morning. Graham was taken into a restricted wing, and I waited in a quiet lounge with wide chairs and soft lighting. Hours passed. I tried reading, then tried resting, but nothing helped. My hands stayed cold the entire time. When Dr. Weber finally appeared, his expression was a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The surgery went well, he said. Your donation stabilized him throughout the procedure. He is in recovery now. My knees weakened with gratitude, but relief did not last long. That night, I was awakened by hurried footsteps in the hallway, nurses speaking in low, urgent voices. A few minutes later, Elise knocked on my door. Amelia, I think you should come with me. Graham is experiencing complications. My heart dropped. She led me to the same glass-walled room where I had met him the day before, only now it was filled with machines and monitors. Graham lay motionless, his chest rising and falling in shallow patterns. He had developed fluid around his heart. They were preparing him for an emergency procedure. Dr. Weber assured me they caught it early, but the fear in the room was unmistakable. As I stood there, someone else entered. A man in his 30s with a sharp suit and sharper eyes. I am Ryan Whitlock, he said, introducing himself as Graham's son. His tone was polite, but his gaze lingered on me with an edge I could feel. So you are the donor, he said, as if testing the weight of the words. My father seems to think highly of you. I explained how I became involved, keeping my voice steady, but I could tell what he was thinking. To him, I was a stranger who had suddenly appeared in his father's life at a vulnerable moment, someone who might want something in return. His suspicion hung in the air, unspoken but heavy. Later, when Graham was taken into the procedure, I returned to my suite, feeling drained. I had come here to help save a life, not to walk into a family's unspoken fears and judgments. But I also knew this was no longer just about blood donations and contracts. Whether I wanted it or not, a thread now tied my life to Graham's. The only question was where that thread would lead. Graham spent the next several days recovering from the emergency procedure. I visited when the nurses allowed it, sitting quietly beside him while he slept, reading aloud when he was awake. Enough to listen. His strength returned slowly, but his spirit sharpened in a way that surprised everyone, including his doctors. One afternoon, as sunlight warmed the room, he motioned for me to sit closer. Amelia, I have spent most of my life solving problems with money, he said. Yet the one thing that saved me came from someone who had none of it left. You gave me more than blood. You gave me time, and I want you to have something in return. I tried to protest, but he lifted a hand gently. Please let me finish. He told me he had been reviewing my business background with his team, not in a prying way, but because he believed I had experience that mattered far more than my failures. He explained that his company often worked with organizations facing crisis, both financial and operational, and that my ability to rebuild after disaster made me uniquely qualified to guide others through the same storms. I want to help you start again, he said, not out of obligation, but because I believe you still have so much to offer. He outlined an idea for a consulting firm focused on recovery planning. Something small at first, but with real potential. His team could help with structure, resources, and early clients. The business would be entirely mine. Before I could respond, he added one more thing. Caleb deserves his future. 2, if he wants to return to school, I can make sure he has the support he needs. No strings attached. The words settled over me like warmth after a long winter. For months I had felt like life had been closing doors faster than I could reach for them. Now, for the first time, someone was opening one. And not just any door, but one that led to a future I had stopped imagining for myself. Leaving Switzerland felt strangely bittersweet. I had arrived there as someone desperate, someone clinging to the hope that a few donations might keep my son's medication cabinet from going empty. I returned home carrying something far different. Plan, a future, and a sense of worth I had not felt in years. Elijah looked the same, but I no longer felt like the same woman who had left it. Caleb hugged me so tightly at the airport that I could barely breathe. He listened to every detail I shared about Graham's recovery, about the consulting idea, about the way life suddenly seemed filled with possibilities again. My sister helped me move into a small but peaceful apartment overlooking a quiet park. It was not the house I lost, but it was mine, and that mattered. I had just started unpacking when someone knocked on my door. The moment I opened it, my stomach tightened. Mark, he stood there with an expression I remember too well, somewhere between regret and calculation. He said he heard about Switzerland, that he knew I had come into money, and that since we were still legally married, it was only fair that he receive a portion of it. I felt a calmness rise in me that surprised us both. Mark, I said quietly, you walked away when everything fell apart. You left me to carry the weight alone. You do not get to return now that things are better. He tried to argue, but the edge in my voice must have told him I meant every word. For the first time, I watched him realize that I was not the same woman he had abandoned. He finally stepped back, muttered something under his breath, and left. I closed the door behind him and leaned against it, letting out a long breath. It was the first moment I fully understood just how much strength had returned to me, not because of money or opportunity or even gratitude from a man across the ocean, but because I had finally chosen myself. A week after Mark walked away from my door, I sat on the small balcony of my new apartment, watching the late afternoon light settle over the park. For the first time in a long time, the air felt calm, not because everything was perfect, but because I finally felt like I had a place to stand again. Caleb had already begun planning his return to school. He talked about architecture with the same spark he used to have before life grew heavy. Seeing that light come back into his eyes felt like its own kind of miracle. As for me, I began sketching out the foundation of my new consulting company. It would start small, a few clients, a simple office, nothing flashy, but it would be built on what I understood better than most: loss, resilience, starting again. One evening I received a message from Graham. He was cleared to travel in a few months and hoped to visit Elijah for follow-up care. He also wanted to see how my plans were unfolding and maybe share a cup of coffee somewhere quiet. I smiled at the screen longer than I meant to. Looking back now, I realized the moment my life changed was not when I stepped off the plane in Switzerland. It was when I walked into a plasma center, believing I had nothing left to give. Sometimes the parts of ourselves we think are empty turn out to be the ones carrying the most worth. If this story resonated with you, feel free to like the video, share it, and leave a comment. Your support helps us bring more heartfelt stories to